April 1945. A captured underground munitions factory outside Gotha, Germany. In a well-heated upper office, porcelain cups clink against saucers. A fan hums in the corner, trying to push away a heavy, sweet stench rising from the floorboards. Two local officials sit in leather chairs, smoothing their clothes. They speak with polite smiles, sipping hot black coffee. Down below, thousands of starved bodies lie in dark, damp concrete tunnels. The officials insist they knew nothing about the subterranean horrors directly beneath their feet. They claim the factory operated above board, and any tragedy below was someone else's department. An American soldier stands by the door, his hands shaking with rage as he listens to their polished excuses. He knows the general is on his way. The defense of ignorance will meet an unyielding, physical answer that these men will never forget. This is the story of an American general who refused to let wealthy bureaucrats distance themselves from the crimes they helped commit. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War, two stories that show the moments that forced people to face what they had done. Captain Michael Rossi was 28 years old, hailing from the rugged streets of Brooklyn, New York, where he had sweated over molten metal as a factory steelworker before answering the call of the draft. He served with the 11th Armored Division, a unit that had fought its way through freezing mud and German armor, but nothing in his training had prepared him for the horrors of this underground labyrinth. Rossi had just spent 4 agonizing hours underground, documenting rows of starved bodies stacked like cordwood in the damp sub-basement tunnels until his throat burned from vomiting. His standard-issue wool uniform was caked with grease, soot, and the literal dust of the dead, his knuckles raw from gripping his rifle too hard. He had seen combat, lost friends, and watched towns burn. But the sight of industrial murder carried out under a veneer of corporate efficiency left him shaken to his very core. Now, he stood in the clean, carpeted administrative suite, his boots leaving tracks of grime on the rug, as he stared at the men who ran the complex. Herr Otto Richter was 58 years old, a factory director and an ardent, card-carrying member of the Nazi Party who had spent the war years ensuring production quotas were met for the military machine. He was born in Leipzig, raised in comfort, and wore his status like armor, standing in a perfectly tailored gray tweed suit, a crisp silk tie, and a heavy gold pocket watch that ticked softly against his vest. Richter viewed the thousands of starved laborers rotting downstairs not as human beings, but as broken machinery, maintaining that his only responsibility was logistics, quotas, and administrative efficiency. He believed that the labor force was entirely an SS matter, a separate bureaucratic entity that freed his own hands from any moral or legal stain. He adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles, smoothed his lapels, and looked at the dirty American liberators with a patronizing detachment, fully expecting his wealth and executive position to shield him from the chaos of Germany's total collapse. By April 1945, the Allied advance across Western Europe had turned into a rapid race into the crumbling heart of the Third Reich. General Patton's Third Army punched deep into Germany, shattering defensive lines and overrunning industrial hubs before the retreating forces could destroy the evidence of their labor systems. As the front lines shattered, the collapsing Nazi administrative state left behind a chaotic landscape of abandoned records, disorganized troops, and sprawling underground complexes. The American forces frequently encountered towns where local populations and prominent civic leaders carried on with their daily routines, pretending the war was a distant inconvenience. In many liberated sectors, conventional military governors often allowed local municipal administrators and industrial managers to remain in their offices temporarily to maintain basic utilities and public order. Many tactical commanders, overwhelmed by the sheer speed of the advance and the logistical burden of handling thousands of prisoners, routinely accepted the superficial compliance of these polished local authorities. Wealthy directors and city mayors quickly learned to present themselves as mere technicians, hoping that a cooperative attitude and a clean suit would insulate them from accountability. They counted on the Americans being too busy with the ongoing military campaign, to look closely at the factories. But the 11th Armored Division was not merely passing through, and the stench rising from the subflooring made ordinary administrative handovers impossible. The illusion of a clean, professional corporate enterprise was about to unravel completely under the glare of a searchlight. The superficial peace of the upper office could not hold against the grim discovery made by the infantrymen downstairs. Captain Rossi stepped fully into the office, his rifle slung tight, his eyes fixed on the factory director. "We need to discuss the lower levels," the captain said. Herr Richter did not look up from his coffee cup immediately, setting it down with deliberate care on a silver saucer. "Everything regarding production is fully documented in the ledgers on the desk," Richter replied. "I am not talking about production quotas or ledger books," Rossi said. "Then you are speaking about matters outside my corporate purview," the director said. "There are over 2,000 emaciated bodies piled in the lower ventilation shafts," Rossi said. The director adjusted his spectacles, his expression remaining entirely neutral. The workforce was supplied and managed exclusively by the regional SS authorities, Richter said. "You sit in this office every single day," the captain said. "My duties require my presence here," Richter replied. "The smell of decomposing flesh is coming directly through your floor vents," Rossi said. "I am an administrator, not a doctor or a guard," the director said. "You watch those people march into this complex every morning," the captain said. "An industrial enterprise requires strict division of labor to remain efficient," Richter replied. "They were worked to death to build your rocket parts," Rossi said. "The state demanded specific quotas, and my job was to meet them," the director said. "You expect me to believe you never went down there," the captain said. "The sub-basement levels were classified military zones under separate command," Richter said. "You signed the requisition orders for the labor supply," Rossi said. "I signed receipts for industrial assets provided by the government," the director replied. "Those assets were human beings, and they were murdered under your feet," the captain said. "The management of those individuals was not my legal responsibility," Richter said. Rossi took a step closer, his voice dropping an octave as he stared at the clean tweed suit. "You stood by and let them starve while you drank your coffee," Rossi said. "I minded my own business, and I suggest you do the exact same," the director replied. Rossi turned to his sergeant waiting by the office door. "Get the radio," the captain ordered. "Who are you calling?" the sergeant asked. "Call headquarters and tell them we need a command decision right now," Rossi said. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep roared up to the front entrance of the administrative building and screeched to a halt. The general climbed out immediately, his uniform immaculate, the 4 silver stars on his helmet catching the pale afternoon light. On his hip, the distinct ivory-handled revolvers rested securely in their holsters. He walked into the upper office unannounced, his boots striking the floorboards with a heavy, rhythmic thump. Every soldier in the room snapped to attention, and the air grew instantly cold. Patton did not raise his voice, but his presence filled the space completely. He stood by the desk, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the factory director. "Did you run this facility?" Patton asked. "I managed the corporate logistics and production scheduling," Richter said. "Did you know what was happening in the sub-basement?" Patton asked. "I had no official knowledge of the lower levels," the director said. "Did you breathe the air in this office?" Patton asked. "Naturally, General, but the administrative staff kept to their duties," Richter replied. Patton studied him for a long moment, his face a mask of absolute stone. "You sit here in a tailored suit and tell me you knew nothing about the thousands of dead men rotting 20 feet beneath your chair," Patton said. "You claim your ledgers and your corporate quotas absolve you of the horror in the dark. You believe that, because you did not pull a trigger, your hands are completely clean. The reality is that your factory worked men to absolute bone and dust to meet your precious schedule. While you sipped your coffee in the warmth, thousands of human beings were treated like industrial waste in the damp, freezing tunnels below. Captain Rossi dug those bodies out, while you sat here, smoothing your silk tie. You have 2 options. You can claim your ignorance to the wind, or you can go down there and get acquainted with the results of your logistics. You and your administrative staff are going down into the dark. You will introduce yourselves to the people you ignored. Richter opened his mouth to protest, his hand reaching instinctively for his gold pocket watch. But the look in the general's eyes cut him off completely. The director swallowed hard, his face turning an ashen gray as he realized his prestige could not save him. He stood in absolute silence, nodding his head once in compliance. The administrative staff moved out of the office under armed guard, their polished shoes clinging against the cold iron stairs as they descended into the dark tunnels. Herr Richter clutched the lapels of his gray tweed suit, the stifling heat of the upper floor vanishing, replaced by a damp, freezing chill that smelled heavily of rot. Down in the pitch-black sub-basement, the beam of an American flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating rows of emaciated corpses stacked against the concrete walls. On Patton's direct order, the factory director, the mayor, and their administrative staff were denied gloves, masks, or tools. Richter's hands trembled as his bare fingers first touched the frozen, filthy skin of a starved laborer he had claimed did not exist. The fine silk ties and tailored jackets were quickly stained with grease, soot, and the grim reality of the subterranean factory. American soldiers stood along the tunnel walls, their rifles ready, watching in absolute silence as the wealthy bureaucrats struggled under the weight of the dead. For 6 grueling hours, the officials carried the rotting bodies out of the tunnels one by one, gasping for breath in the foul air. Outside, the townspeople were forced to line the streets of Gotha, watching in stunned silence as their pristine leaders laid the dead into individual graves dug directly into the town square, permanently curing the illusion of corporate ignorance. Captain Rossi returned home to Brooklyn, New York, following the formal demobilization of the 11th Armored Division later that autumn. He went back to work at the steel plant, the deafening roar of the blast furnaces helping to drown out the lingering memory of the silent concrete tunnels outside Gotha. He lived a quiet, unassuming life with his family, refusing to look at newspaper clippings from Germany and never purchasing a German-made automobile for the rest of his days. Rossi passed away quietly in August 1984, carrying the invisible weight of that subterranean complex to his grave. Herr Richter was arrested by military authorities the following morning and spent 2 years in an Allied internment camp awaiting a formal denazification tribunal. The court stripped him of his corporate titles and confiscated his family property in Leipzig, reducing him to a low-level clerk in a rebuilding West German municipality. He lived out his remaining years in a cramped, 2-room apartment, deeply bitter about the collapse of his social status and complaining to his neighbors about the unfairness of Victor's justice. Richter died in obscurity in 1968, still maintaining to his final breath that he was merely a businessman who followed orders. General Patton never mentioned the underground rocket factory in his public briefings, but he recorded the inspection in a private journal entry on the night of the incident. He kept a small, tarnished brass rivet from the Gotha assembly line in his desk drawer for the remainder of his command. He remarked to his chief of staff that some men need to smell the dirt before they can see the sky. Some historians have argued that the punishment imposed on the factory administration bypassed standard legal frameworks, representing an emotional, theater-driven reaction rather than a structured military inquiry. They suggest that forcing civilian administrators to manually exhume and bury bodies blurred the lines between individual judicial guilt and collective community responsibility during a chaotic occupation. Others have argued the opposite, maintaining that the extreme nature of the underground atrocities demanded an immediate, undeniable lesson to pierce the widespread local pretense of ignorance. They contend that a public, physical confrontation with the dead was the only effective method to dismantle the defense of corporate neutrality. What is certain is that the forced graves in the town square established a permanent, undeniable physical record of the local complex's complicity, ensuring that the argument of not knowing could never be used in that municipality again. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have left the punishment to the formal war crimes tribunals later that year? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the moments that forced people to face what they had done, make sure to subscribe.